Good evening. I want to thank you for joining us this evening, this beautiful evening, which I'm glad we can also see behind us. But for the Philadelphia Commons Institute, we are delighted to host Dr. Byron Johnson for the lecture entitled Religion Behind Bars, Transformation, Rehabilitation, and Criminal Justice Reform. We are in for such a treat tonight. The founder of Philadelphia, William Penn, was himself behind bars for his religion. As a Quaker, he was put into prison for not being Anglican, the state church. In an interesting turn of history, however, this incarcerated person was given a whole tract of land in North America, where we're sitting right now, Pennsylvania. I can't help but wonder if his time in prison made him conscious of the fact, especially on a day like today where it's so beautiful, when you don't have choice and you can't go outside and feel the sun on your face, you pay more attention to such things. And so when William Penn created the city of Philadelphia and he made parks that weren't owned by any one person but were public land, you can't help but wonder if William Penn was thinking about his time in prison, wanting everyone to have the experience of being outside and feeling the sun on your face. But he also created when he created Philadelphia, he created it very specifically through his Charter of Privileges. In 1701, William Penn's Charter of Privileges, which he also called his Holy Experiment, made it so that everyone who came to Philadelphia could worship as they pleased. They could have jobs and houses and land, regardless of their religion. Again, remember, this was someone who was in prison for believing something differently than the state church. What's interesting also, William Penn being a Quaker, believing in peace, believing in green space, is this idea of prisons. So Quakers did quite a lot to create prisons. In Philadelphia, I don't know if you've been to Eastern State Penitentiary, but Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States first and foremost to study our prison system because we were innovative and interesting at the time. And the way we did prisons was something that Europe wanted to learn about. The penitentiary system, right, it was about a penitent heart. And the Quakers spearheaded some of these ideas about what makes people reform and want to reform. Of course, now we're in a very different position with prisons. And as the current discussion around criminal justice reform has led us to believe, even yesterday's New York Times, there were some very scary stories about Alabama. I don't know if you saw those. But the things happening behind prisons often are things that make people scared and sad and not proud of our country. And so I think we are in such a good position to listen to our speaker this evening. I have known him for, we were just talking, almost 20 years, which I was just a small child. No, I was in college. And I want to tell you more about that in just a minute. But what we have in our speaker is an expert not just in criminal justice, not just in criminology, but in religion and in different creative ways of understanding how religions can talk to each other. So again, we are deeply fortunate to have a scholar known for both his excellence in religious scholarship and for his scholarship in the field of criminology here. And he told me to keep his bio short, but I really have to read some of these highlights because they're amazing. This is someone who is top in my book. He right now is a distinguished professor of social sciences at Baylor University and the founding director of Baylor's Institute for Studies of Religion, or ISR. He is a faculty scholar in the Center of Spirituality, Theology, and Health at Duke University. He's a senior advisor in the Religious Freedom Research Project at Georgetown University. He's a senior fellow with the Witherspoon Institute at Princeton. He's a senior fellow at the Sagamore Institute in Indianapolis, and is a senior advisor at the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. Before joining the faculty at Baylor University, Johnson directed research centers at Vanderbilt University and the University of Pennsylvania. Professor Johnson is a former member of the Coordinating Council for Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, which was a presidential appointment. Johnson has recently published a number of articles on the role of faith and service in helping addicts remain sober. He is recognized as a leading authority on the scientific study of religion and the efficacy of faith-based organizations and criminal justice. Recent publications have examined the impact of faith-based programs on offender treatment, recidivism, and reduction. Sorry, that's a word I just love to say, so I'm just going to say it slowly. Recidivism. Reduction, prison reentry, and the subject of his book, More God, Less Crime, 2011. Johnson also directs the program on pro-social behavior, which examines the ways in which religion impacts key behaviors like volunteerism, generosity, and purpose. So I want you to hear from criminology and deviant behaviors maybe to pro-social behaviors as well. His new book, The Quest for Purpose, which was released in 2017, he's working currently with the Gallup organization to design empirical studies exploring religion and spirituality in the world. Byron is married to Jackie Johnson, a wonderful, wonderful woman, and they have 3 children and 7 grandchildren. I hear maybe 1 on the way, maybe more, and just a wonderful family. But behind and beyond his many accolades and accomplishments, Byron is a tremendous mentor and a committed Christian. I met him when I just figured out, maybe 20, 21 years old. My dad, who's a professor at Penn, said, whatever you do before you graduate, you need to sit down with this man I just met, Byron Johnson. And I did, and it was one of the best decisions of my life. It took my life in a different course. I was an English major. I sat down with Byron, himself a committed Christian, and he showed me how a social scientist can make amazing cases for both faith and also study behaviors as well. I remember right after college, I didn't exactly know what I was going to do, and Byron offered me a job. And in that job, I was able to prepare for grad school. I also was able to do some real empirical studies. We sat down with, the General Social Survey, something I had not been exposed to in my English major education. And the General Social Survey, if you don't know, is this longitudinal study. Generations of people are asked the same questions over and over about religion. And Byron said, here, take these 2, 3, 4 phone books. Look through all the questions of religion and tell me what you notice. First of all, I noticed there were just a few questions. Second of all, I noticed they were asked quite poorly. And Byron said, why don't you write some new questions, and why don't we try to do it here at Penn? And it was just an amazing project, and it opened my mind and made me think about what work there is to be done in the world. And so I introduced to you a scholar who is a mentor, but someone who is good at inspiring young people and older folks, now I'm one, alike. Please join me in welcoming Byron Johnson.
Wow. It is so good to be back here in Philadelphia. This is like home to us. And just so many people here. First of all, our son Jeremy, who really never left Philly except to go get a few degrees and then come back. He came back in the summers and made the wise choice to stay. And so we're thrilled that Jeremy and Rachel, we get to see them when we come back to Philadelphia. And just so many other people, not only Leah, but Catherine back there, another student that we had the chance to work with together at Penn. It was those were amazing days for all of us, and it's so good to see you both and see people like Ron Sider, the great Ron Sider here on the front row, who I've known for years, and I've always appreciated Ron's work, and we still get to see each other occasionally, and Matt and just so many other people. It's so good to be back home. So let me start out by saying I am going to be talking about prisons, but first I wanted to mention something about church attendance. Church attendance is a profound thing. There's a passage in Hebrews 10:25 that some of you are familiar with that says that we should assemble together and we should take it seriously. And it's a simple variable that we collect data on. Do you go to church? How often do you go to church? And some people criticize it, but the reality is there are other ways that we study faith, religiosity. We ask people different kinds of questions. But believe it or not, it's this question that appears to be the best question that you can ask people to understand how devout they are, how often they attend. And church attendance, if I had to give anyone any advice, I would say raise your kids in a house of worship. The statistics are staggering. So what I've just put up on the screen there are just some recent studies that we've done in the area of crime with adults, delinquency with kids, drug and alcohol abuse, even domestic violence. The huge protective factor through all of those studies, and again, this is just a sampling of those studies, is church attendance. If you're raised in a rotten neighborhood and you're raised in poverty and one or both of your parents are incarcerated, you're probably going to make it if you go to church. Now, we don't know a lot about why that is the case. We have some good ideas, but I did want to make the case that it's not just prisons that are important, it's church attendance that it's important for prisons. And so prosocial behavior, as Leah mentioned, is the other thing. You know, we do a good job of studying what is the likelihood that you're going to be mugged on the way home tonight. I think it's quite depressing. I would rather study the likelihood that someone is going to do a favor for you tonight. Why do people do so many acts of kindness in the world? We don't monitor that very much. We look at the antisocial behavior, but there's so much prosocial going on that we need to start looking at that. And as we do look at it, what we find is that it's largely motivated because people go to houses of worship. That's why there's so many acts of kindness in the world. So, prisons. This journey started for me as a graduate student. I wanted to know, back in the Paleolithic era, if religion was alive and well in prison, since I knew religion was important in my own life. And so I started studying born-again Christians. That's what I did for my dissertation. And I was very disappointed when I found that in a particular prison in Florida, where I had captured data for 10 years, looking at inmates who said they had become born-again Christians versus inmates that had no religious experience while they were incarcerated. And I followed them for 10 years and found that there was no difference. So this is a discouraging finding for my first study. And that was about the last study where I found that religion wasn't important. And there are all kinds of good reasons why that study found that religion didn't matter, because all I had data on was that one variable pretty much of religious conversion. And there's so much more that goes into it than just that. So subsequently, I did a study for a prison fellowship. You may remember that first slide up there. There was a man sitting in a cell. That was Chuck Colson after he went to prison, the former Watergate figure. Some of you are too young to know who that is or was. He found God in prison and started a ministry called Prison Fellowship. It's now the largest ministry in the world dedicated to offenders. So I did a study for them in 1997 in 4 different prisons where we looked at Bible studies led by volunteers that go into institutions and do a 1-hour-a-week Bible study. It's not much of an intervention, is it? Just 1 hour a week. And yet I found that once they got out of prison, they were dramatically less likely to be rearrested with just that one intervention. Well, that led Prison Fellowship to think, well, if a Bible study can be effective, what if we could do more than just a Bible study? And it led them to launch a whole prison, well, at that time, half a prison, that was faith-based. So this was in Houston, Texas. So that half the population was in the faith-based prison and half the population was in the regular population. And I remember Prison Fellowship saying, we don't want these two to mingle because we don't want the faith-based side to be contaminated by all these bad guys in the general population. Well, after a couple of months, there were all these covert Bible studies going on where guys in the faith-based side were, illegally penetrating the other side and doing Bible studies with inmates over there, having baptistries going. It was full-blown ministry, and then they changed the whole prison to faith-based. And so I studied that prison for a number of years, and that study was published in 2003 with dramatic results. And that led Prison Fellowship to think, okay, this is really interesting. Something's going on here that we need to kind of figure out how we can replicate this elsewhere. And they started replicating that model of a faith-based prison. Well, I went back and revisited that study I had done on the Bible studies, remember, and tracked those guys over time and found that they were still less likely over time to be rearrested. So not sure what all was going on, but it could have been that a lot of these guys were connected to congregations on the outside through the Bible studies. And anyways, that culminated in this book that I did in 2011, which summarized about 20 years worth of research on the role of religion in prisons. And as Leah said, religion in prisons has been around ever since we've had prisons. And you can go to any prison in America right now and you'll find all kinds of religious activities going on. One of the things I want to do for policymakers is different than what I would like to do for other people. So for me, I want to know about all the changes that are happening in the life of an inmate and their family and beyond. Policymakers just want to know if they're going to be in trouble or not. Are they staying out of trouble while they're in prison, and then do they stay out of trouble when they get out of prison? Can religion do that? So we evaluated one of these prison fellowship prisons in Minnesota, and not only did the program help them stay out of trouble while they're in prison, it helped them stay out of trouble when they got out of prison and helped them live positive lives. And that program saved taxpayers $8,300 per person. So when we did a cost-benefit analysis, and so once you start doing those kinds of studies, now other people are beginning to listen. You know, they may be a little queasy about the religion part, but if it's saving taxpayers money, they really like it. Perhaps the most innovative program is this next one. It's called the Prison Entrepreneurship Program. This is where businessmen go into prisons, find entrepreneurial inmates, and help them to create business plans. Those business plans are then graded by college students. And so most of the Ivy League schools participate in this particular program. Baylor participates in it. And then these guys get out and actually form their own companies and their own businesses. So it's a complete paradigm shift where you're thinking most inmates have a difficult time even finding a job. How would you like to be an inmate that runs your own company? So we did an ROI on this, and the return on investment is 340% on that one. All of these, by the way, are privately funded. I wanted to spend some time talking about this place. This is the Louisiana State Penitentiary, where we've just finished a major study that took us 5 years. This is a maximum security prison. It's the largest maximum security prison in America. It's also known as the most, or has been known as the bloodiest prison in America. Very violent, corrupt. It's not the end of the world, but you can see it from there. It's located in the swamps of Louisiana. This is on a hilltop looking down over a part of the prison. It's 18,000 acres. It's also known as Angola. That is because it was a plantation, and the slaves came from Angola, Africa. So they don't call it the Louisiana State Penitentiary. It's just called Angola. Maybe 5 or 6 movies that you've seen on television were filmed at Angola. It's an unusual place. It's not a destination job if you're a warden. See those alligators? That's what happens if you escape. You can get eaten by an alligator. But this is how these cells look. 6,300 inmates. Again, most maximum security prisons are very small, 1,000 to 1,500 inmates. This one has 6,300. It's ridiculous in so many different ways. And this is a cemetery where about 3 guys die a month because they're all serving life. Virtually all the inmates are serving life. They all die in there. So at some level, it's the most depressing place that you could ever imagine. Well, this is a warden that went there in 1995 and had this idea, what if I were to start a Bible college in the prison? Might that help the institution kind of turn the corner? And I heard about him, and what I heard was he's a different kind of a guy. He's strange. And when the book More God, Less Crime came out in 2011, he called me, and he said, have you heard about what's happening here? I said, well, I have heard bits and pieces. He says, why isn't it no one takes us seriously at this prison, because our prison has changed. It's not a violent, corrupt prison anymore. It used to be, where homicides and stabbings and suicides were so common. He goes, it's all changed. And I said, well, we would need some empirical research to kind of verify that. So make a long story short, we launched a big study there with a team of 5 scholars over 5 years. And the study started in 2012. And this is the New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary, as you can see behind bars. It's a Baptist seminary, but it's really quite ecumenical. We've hung out there for weeks and weeks and months over the years, sitting in classes, talking to inmates. This is Philippians 3:13. It's just a scripture that you see when you come into the prison, and if you notice, you can't see it from back there, but the passage at the end, the scripture reference is whited out. The ACLU was threatening a lawsuit, so they said, well, would it help if we just scratched out the scripture reference? And they said, good enough. So the scripture still is there. This is a class at the seminary that's taking place. This is the library, and they read books. They read big books, difficult to read books. These guys, their understanding of religion is quite amazing. This again is the cemetery. This is a casket, and some of you may recognize it. They build their own caskets for the inmates there, since they're all dying there. They cost $217, made out of plywood. The inside of the casket is made with comforters from Walmart. And the Graham family would go to Angola to do services, and George Beverly Shea would sing there up until the time when he died. And the Graham family wanted Billy and Ruth to be buried in one of these caskets. So when Billy Graham died and his body was in the rotunda in Washington, D.C., it was one of the caskets built by an inmate serving life. And it's really interesting. So I wrote a piece on it for the Gospel Coalition, and it was their number one article that year. It had so many hits where people had read it because they had heard about Billy Graham being buried in one of these caskets. And my phone rang off the hook. People wanted to be buried. They wanted to be in a casket made by inmates in Angola. I said that was reserved for Billy and Ruth, not just for anybody else. This is the hospice unit, since they're all aging out and dying there. The sentencing laws in Louisiana are so dramatically different than any other part of the country. It's stunning. There's a guy there that's serving like 950 years. The average length of sentence, I think, is around 98. It's just over the top. And but this is another inmate taking care of a dying inmate. They have so many different ministries there that these people that go to the seminary are trained. The guy there in the middle of the room is serving life sentence for murder. This is their VoteTech area. It is one of the most progressive VoteTech programs I've seen in any prison in America. This is an inmate pastor. So they have 29 churches. We didn't know this when we started the project. We went there to study the effect of having a Bible college in a prison. But what we found when we went there were all these congregations: Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Pentecostal, Catholic. You name it, they have it. And these pastors have all kinds of ministries. They have entire staffs. So they have deacons, associate pastors, music team leaders. This is an ID card reserved only for inmate ministers. So to have one of these cards is pretty unusual. It allows you to go anywhere in the prison at any time. And the correctional officers they know who these guys are, and they won't bother them. If they do, the warden will have them fired. So it's this unusual thing where we're thinking, these churches are pretty phenomenal. This is one of the churches. This is another church, all paid for with private money. This is another church. This is the most recent church. It's a Catholic church. These are the names on one of the walls, a plaque of missionaries, inmate ministers who graduated from the Bible College and were transferred to other prisons in Louisiana. So that gave us an idea of a project. And so Texas has implemented their version of Angola, except Texas won't allow inmate congregations. Neither will any other state in the country. Louisiana, they do what they want. And so Texas has a model where in their seminary, they train ministers and they send them out in groups of 3 or 4. So there are over 100 prisons in Texas. And so we're tracking those guys too. And the early returns are pretty shocking. They're having an effect, which is pretty amazing when you think you would send 3 ministers to a prison with 3,500 inmates. what kind of reception do you think that they would get? Some people thought that, they would be ridiculed or mocked, and instead they're on call 24 hours a day. We were talking earlier about suicide, that we have a national suicide problem. You can't believe how severe it is in prisons. Right now, suicide is the second leading cause of death between the ages of 10 and 34 in the U.S. That's how big of a suicide problem that we have. And in prisons, it's much more than that. So these guys are on suicide watch. Some of the findings, real quick. What we found is if you go to the Bible college, you're much less likely to get in trouble. We didn't look at recidivism because none of them are getting out. They're all staying there. But they're much less likely to be in trouble if they attend the Bible college. But if they also go to church and don't go to the Bible college, it makes a big difference in their behavior while they're in prison. If they do both, it's off the charts. So the place has become, like the last few years, no suicides at all, 0. Stabbings, very rare. Homicides almost never happen there now. It's a completely changed place, and it's not like it's been completely saturated with the gospel. 6,000 guys there. So the findings are pretty incredible. We haven't seen anything like it. And one of the things that we do is we interview inmates over time. So if you're there for 5 years, you get to see them all through the week. You get to see them on the weekends. You get to see them in evening hours. You get to see them in the morning. And so it's hard to fake us out when we're doing interviews like this repeatedly, in-depth interviews and surveys. And so one of the things that we've been able to document and to do so empirically and to publish it is identity transformation. Again, it's all biblical. These people literally are able to rewrite their life narratives. For so many offenders, dealing with their past is a difficult issue. But for these guys, it's not a difficult issue. Because what's happened is their faith allows them to be able to put their lives in perspective. They are not who they used to be. They're actually someone different now. And all the surveys seem to indicate that they literally have a new identity. And so we call them redemption scripts, redemption narratives. It's fascinating to see this. And criminologists, secular criminologists, are also fascinated by this concept of identity transformation. The warden liked to call it moral rehabilitation. We said, no, warden, it's not. We're not going to use that language, but we can use this other language. And the warden, by the way, he reminded us of Boss Hogg. If you ever saw that dreadful show, Dukes of Hazzard, you couldn't understand a word he said. You just couldn't. But he was convinced that the remedy for every prison in America is a Bible college. And we kept saying, warden, that's not what we found. The Bible college provided the training to empower the churches, and these ministries within these churches have served the whole body of the prison. It's the churches that have changed the prison, not the Bible college. The Bible college has played a key role, but it put wind in the sails of the churches. The churches were there. In fact, the churches go back almost 100 years, but they were small, they were struggling, and guess what? They were African American. The whites didn't go. And over time, it began to change. Now, a lot of the congregations are interracial. So it's a fascinating experiment, and every time we would go there, here you are going to backward Louisiana, and you have a group from New York and California and Washington State there trying to figure out what is it that they're doing in Louisiana that we might copy. And the warden would say, go start a Bible college. And we would say, that's not what they need to hear. They need to hear it's a little bit more complicated than that. What we found really, two things. It's the act of service that's really important here. As these inmates serve others, it takes the eyes off themselves. And that too is a biblical imperative. And as they're serving others through sidewalk counseling and grief counseling, how would you like to be locked up for life and see all your family die? Most of you would think, how terrible to rot in prison, how terrible to not be there when your children die and your parents die. That's what they go through. And I went to that prison for 5 years, and I would see inmates that have more hope and more meaning in their lives than most people that I deal with. It's pretty amazing if you know that's actually where you're going to die. So, redemption narratives, identity transformation. This is where the inmates have their own ministers have their own office. This is the book we wrote on it. It's received incredible reviews by some of the world's top criminologists, which is fantastic because it's all about God and how God can change a life, redeem it. These are just some passages from the Bible that talk about faith and service. And in addition to the book, these are a bunch of papers that we have published on the Angola story. But I wanted to switch gears before I wrap up. This is a picture of MS-13. Have you heard of MS-13? The violent gang that's a global phenomenon, notorious. This was in a kind of a cover story for The Economist, a secular publication. And this is a jail in El Salvador where they just have them crammed in there. And scholars, a team of scholars from Florida International went down there because people have been hearing about this. There's revival in El Salvador among MS-13. They're becoming Christians. A lot of them are becoming Pentecostal. And so it got us thinking as we went back and looked at everything that we had done at Angola, and we began to realize they don't let people come in and preach like, the Grahams don't. They stop them from preaching, and other volunteers from the outside. It's all inmate-led. And so it got us thinking that maybe this inmate-led thing is really important, just like indigenous missionaries, right? So we have a proposal before the Templeton Foundation to go down and do a study in El Salvador of this group. Apparently, it's the only way they will let you out of the gang and live is if you have an authentic conversion. I thought, don't you find that interesting? Because if it's not authentic, they'll kill you. But if it is authentic, they'll let you live. This is a New York Times article on how to leave MS-13 alive. And it's basically find God and stay true to it, and they'll leave you alone. So just an interesting concept. So we're calling them inmate-led religious movements. It's the next best thing. And if you've never heard an inmate preach, they're the best. You just can't believe what you're hearing. I mean, I've listened to these guys preach for an hour without ever looking at a note. It's pretty phenomenal. And their families are allowed to come in and attend church on Sundays. And so now you see staff, correctional officers and administrators that come under the preaching of inmates that they are supervising. I've never seen anything like it. And as I said, unfortunately, this model can't be replicated because other states won't allow it. So as we talk about criminal justice reform, one of the things that we need to revisit is why can't we? And the reason why, by the way, is because of a failed trustee system from years past. You may have heard of inmates supervising other inmates with guns and how they brutalized other inmates. That was a common thing at Angola. Why hire guards if you can have inmates to guard the inmates? And so all states have outlawed the trustee system by saying no inmate can have authority over another inmate. But by doing so, states will not allow inmate-led congregations. So that we see is a huge problem if you are, in fact, going to try to replicate the Angola story. One of the things, before I wrap this up, I wanted to say is we're doing a bunch of studies now on faith-based drug treatment, and we're finding the same thing, that if addicts find God, it helps them, but they still relapse. If they find God and give their lives away to other inmates who are addicts, and they work with them, they stay sober. So in a completely different setting, we're finding the same thing we found in Angola. It's finding God, giving your life to God, and giving your life away in service to your brothers or sisters that is the real transformation. That's when people stay sober. That's when they get a new identity transformation that takes them on a different path. And I think this is one of the problems that we have with the opioid crisis that we were talking about earlier. All across the country, this is a huge problem. overdoses are up sixfold in the last 19 years. And some of the same problems we find: social isolation, narcissistic kind of behavior, looking inwardly instead of connecting to people and to others. That's where the solutions really lie. So I think I'm going a little long, Leah. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up for a few questions. Yes, in the back.
The prison fellowships that you were talking about, are those all like primarily Christian, or are there like different types of religious, like organizations for?
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is a question that I get every single time. They're Christian. There are Muslims who participate in the program. You don't have to be Christian. You don't have to be anything to sign up. You can go to seminary, or you can participate in a faith-based program. You just sign up for them. We've had Muslims to go all the way through and graduate. And so one of the things that, as you might expect, when you ask them, what did you think? They go, I loved it. The Jesus stuff went in this ear and out this ear. But the rest of it is all good for me. And so we actually now have Muslim ministers, missionaries in Texas that are serving Christian inmates. It's phenomenal. And they do the best job they can. If they're on suicide watch that night, for example, you'll have a Muslim that'll reach out to an inmate that says that they're a Christian and do the best they can to talk to them that night. We don't have enough time to wait for somebody else to get here if this person's contemplating suicide. We will be at a point at some time in the future where we'll be able to look at some other programs, but right now most of these programs are not just Christian, they tend to be evangelical. They're privately paid for. None of this is paid for by the government. So that's the next thing that hopefully is coming down the pike, will be other kinds of faith-based programs that we can study. Yes, all the way in the back.
Byron, could you talk more about the acts of service? Just flesh that out a little bit more, kind of what types of acts of service, and just explain that a little more.
Yeah. So inmates make about, I think it's 17 cents an hour. I mean, it's not a lot, right? And they tithe. And they have benevolence ministries to the poor. And you're thinking, okay, let me see. They're serving life, they're in prison, they're not making anything, and yet there are people that are poor. Well, you can, a family can send money in, and it goes into an account, so you can buy special things, they can buy tennis shoes or whatever if there is enough money in their account. So guys literally will give things that they have to indigent offenders in prison. That's how they help them. They help them with homework. Obviously, the grief issue is a big issue for so many of them as they're getting older. And, it's an amazing thing. I interviewed guys in their 80s that have been locked up for over 60 years, 70 years. And so, anyways, when you talk to them, you find out the joy that they have in serving other people. And so they do it in so many different ways. A lot of these guys are mentoring the young inmates. The guy that you saw in the vocational area, I mean, that's all he does is work with younger inmates to make their lives better. Some of them actually may get out because the prison now has become such a model that they are sending these guys there that are not lifers. And so the older prisoners, instead of resenting the guys that are coming in, some of these guys, you remember the 3 strikes and you're out? They got a life sentence with no parole for committing their 3rd felony, even if it wasn't an act of violence. Now a kid comes in who committed an act of violence, but he got 10 years. This kid's getting out, and this lifer who didn't do anything nearly as bad as that has already been in prison for 40 years, and he's mentoring this guy. That's the act of service that we saw over, and to do it joyfully, while the kid doesn't appreciate it, because he's tough. So those are the kinds of things you see it over and over again, and guess what? What happens is it's transformative. It absolutely works. It's the gospel lived out. And anyways, we're doing our best to be able to take that kind of information and put it in a format that will help practitioners and academics to understand that this stuff is actually important. And we're having some success. Leah, how are we doing on time? We can take some more questions. Yes, ma'am.
I don't understand why the states would be against churches and how they could compare that to trustees.
Yeah.
Trustees were violent, they,
Yeah.
like you said, they had guns. What authority does a church have
Right.
except for we're offering this
Yeah.
to you?
It's such a tragic irony because the pastors will say, I have no authority at all. I'm here to serve. I'm not here to lord any authority over any inmate. So it's a terrible policy decision. We're hopeful that we can get it changed. We keep publishing because, we don't want to, one study shows that this works. No, we have, multiple studies that we're coming at from different angles to try and make the best argument that the states would be foolish not to think of these things when they think about reform. Why would you want to implement half the model and disregard the other half? And it's really interesting because a lot of these progressive states really are snubbing the magic part of this, what really works. So I'm hopeful that if we keep at it, that we can be a part of these discussions. So far, we haven't been able to move that ball. In Texas, which is kind of a faith-friendly state, they wanted to do this, but only the missionary part of it. But what's happening in Texas is they're creating what they call God pods, where they are doing unofficial congregations, and the warden knows it. So the warden is just looking the other way, because once you interview these people long enough, you find out the warden's a Christian. And is thrilled that the program is there. It's making his job and all the staff easier. I mean, it's a high-stress environment. So it would be good for the employees if we would think about changing the system. So, the new criminal justice reforms, the new prison reform that's just been enacted is only at the federal level. It's a positive, it's a step in the right direction, but we have a long ways to go. And the other thing is, these things are all privately paid for. So we have nothing to lose there. So this is not like it's a drain. And so I think the implications are pretty serious, but not just for this, but for substance abuse and other kinds of areas. I mean, we've not even looked at people coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq that are experiencing PTSD. I kind of think that if we could reach out to these guys with ministries, these men and women coming home that are struggling, I think the same formula, faith and service. Don't let them isolate themselves and medicate themselves, but let them go out and help other people as they get introduced to God. And I think what it does is it takes our eyes off ourselves, and God's transforming us, and we don't even know it till others tell us that we're a completely different person. So I think the implications go beyond prisons and can help us in a lot of different areas where we're really suffering right now. Maybe a couple more. Ron Sider, I have to go to Ron.
I've got a kind of broad question. You've been working at, faith-based programs, evaluating them, and you know all about the conflicts with government and whatever partnership. Would you reflect on where we are today compared with, say, 20 or 25 years ago? Is it more open to partnership, less open? Where are we?
Yeah. Ron, that is such a good question. In some ways, I think we've made some progress, but on the ground, when I talk to people that work in faith-based ministries, they feel under attack. This is what they tell me. They wonder if they'll still be in business in the future. They wonder if their faith-based organizations will still be have tax-exempt status in the future. Some of them exist on fumes, as they tell me. And so a change like that could put them out of business. So it's a complicated question. Dwight Gibson asked me a question about a study we did 2 years ago on homelessness, the faith-based response to homelessness. Stunning. So we couldn't do every city, so we did 13 cities across the United States and looked at who's providing for the homeless. 60% of the beds are provided by faith-based organizations, and we didn't even look at churches. We just looked at gospel rescue missions and organizations like that that reach out to the homeless and provide services for them. So the cost savings to the U.S. government are staggering. And we acknowledge that we missed a lot of what was happening. But when we went to the cities, we talked to the mayors. Doesn't matter if they're Republican or Democrat, every mayor said the same thing. We'd be lost without these faith-based groups. We love them. And you go to the secular groups, they say the same thing. They refer all the time. It's amazing the kind of cooperation that you see on the ground because it's absolute necessity. They have to do this. So there's all kinds of sacred secular partnerships that are happening on the ground. We don't get out into the heartland very much to see this. We're always looking to Washington, probably the last place that we should be looking to see what's kind of happening on that ground. So there's still concern, I think, from faith-based groups that we haven't made as much progress. But I'll say, for me, what we've seen is a lot of partnerships around some of these issues. And, disaster relief is another one. So one of the things that we want to do a better job of is kind of quantifying. What does that mean in dollars and cents? That faith-based groups are taking some of the more difficult challenges head on. And what does that mean to society? So that's why we need to do cost-benefit analysis, return on investment, so that policymakers will have something solid that they can look at. One of our first studies on this indicates, it's a guess, $1.2 trillion a year provided in social services to the country by faith-based groups. So it's pretty big. Maybe the last question. Yes, sir.
Have you looked at quantifying the value of the congregations, whether informal or formal in
This is a huge interest of ours. That's been done a little bit with Ram Kanan, a former Penn colleague of mine, and several other studies have looked at congregations. What we call it the halo effect. What do these congregations do for the neighborhoods where they're embedded? And it's staggering. Ram Kanan study that he did in Philadelphia, published in 2000, I believe, showed that even back then, they were providing $250 million worth of social service delivery, just the congregations in the city. I want to bring it down to the congregation level. There are plenty of congregations that I think are probably spinning off millions of dollars in social service benefit to that neighborhood, but we haven't quantified it. And we need to be able to do that. It's eminently doable. You got to come up with a methodology that you can implement. But that's one of the things that we've been thinking about doing. So that way you could say, what do these houses of worship actually mean in dollars and cents to a community? So the last thing you want is this congregation to go out of business because you know that they're actually helping the community. It's a great question. Leah, back to you. Thank you for having me.
So I hope you all enjoyed this evening. My mind is going in so many different directions, but just the idea, I wish I had the scripture memorized, the entire Bible. But when Jesus looks at us and says, when I was in prison, did you visit me? And I think as Dr. Johnson was talking, that was what I was hearing in my spirit. Who am I visiting? Why is it that I don't know a thing about what the experience of prisoners, what it's like, and that there are churches in prison? Why was that such a new idea for me tonight? So what I'd like to do is encourage all of you. So at the Philadelphia Commons Institute, what I didn't say before when I did my introduction is that we see ourselves as intellectual and dialogical green space. And so we hope that we don't have a formal conversation planned afterwards, but we hope that you'll gather. I have some fellows in the audience. You guys want to raise your hand? Yeah. A bunch. They have name tags. If you want to talk informally with them or talk with others around, I hope there's just ideas in your head the way that there are in mine from the lecture we heard tonight. And I would like to also remind you that we are a 501c3. There probably are some in prisons. I don't know. There's a nonprofit organization, and we depend on sponsorship, on gifts and donations. So please, we have a donation table there. We also have ways to give online. So please consider partnering with us in continuing good lectures like this one, excellent lectures like this one, and our undergraduate fellowship program. Thank you all, and have an excellent evening.